There are books that hold stories, and books that become them. In a quiet shop along a street you do not recall, a name long buried is about to be spoken again. But the Chronicle remembers only what the world forgets. To write in its pages is not to record the past. It is to offer yourself as its next story. The rain drummed against the narrow windows of Greer's antiquarian books, like skeletal fingers seeking entry. Thaddeus Greer sat hunched over his ledger, cataloguing the day's meagre sales with the methodical precision that had sustained his business for 42 years. The shop smelled of leather and must, of secrets locked away in forgotten volumes. He had long ago learned to ignore the superstitions of other collectors, books that whispered in the dark corners of estate sales, pages that allegedly bled when touched by moonlight, crates sealed in wax with crooked pentagrams, and Latin so poor it would make a seminary student weep. It was all theatre, he told himself. Valuable theatre that drove up prices, certainly, but Greer was a man of ink and logic, of provenance and profit. Or so he believed. The delivery came during the worst of the storm, when the gas lamps flickered like dying candles and the wind howled through the narrow alley behind his shop. No knock at the front door, no chime of the brass bell he'd inherited from the previous owner, no sound of footsteps on wet cobblestone or the rumble of a horse-drawn cart. Just the sudden crack of thunder that seemed to split the world in two, followed by the grinding scrape of wood against stone. Greer found the crate wedged against his rear service entrance, as if it had been slid through like a coffin into a tomb. The wood was black with age and water, bound with rusted iron strips that had bled orange stains down its sides. No shipping label, no return address, no indication of who might have sent it, or why. He examined what remained of the original label first, a habit ingrained by decades of dealing with questionable acquisitions. The paper was waterlogged, curling at the edges like dying leaves. Most of the ink had bled away into illegible smears, but one word remained, faint as breath fogging cold glass. Archive. The lock had already been broken, or perhaps had never existed at all. Inside, wrapped in cloth so rotted it crumbled at his touch and nestled in straw that smelled of decay and salt air, was a book unlike any in his extensive collection. It was chained shut with links of tarnished silver, each one inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The leather binding was thick and scarred, blooming with patches of mould that seemed to shift in the lamplight. Salt crystals clung to its edges, as if it had been dredged from the depths of the sea. Along the spine something had been etched, not words in any language he recognized, but symbols that seemed to writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. When he lifted the book from its mouldering nest, it was heavier than it should have been, as if weighted with more than paper and ink. The moment his fingers touched the binding, a name echoed through his thoughts with the clarity of a church bell. Amelia, his sister, lost to time and illness when he was barely 12 years old. Or had it been an accident? The memory felt strangely fluid, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. He could picture her face, or thought he could, but the details shifted each time he tried to focus on them. He hadn't thought of her in decades, had trained himself not to. The Chronicle, for that was what he'd begun calling it, refused to open. Greer tried all the methods he'd learned over the years. He held it near the coal stove until the leather grew warm and pliable. He spoke the Latin phrases he'd memorized from medieval manuscripts, feeling foolish even as the words left his lips. He tried to force the locks with thin metal tools, but they wouldn't yield even a fraction of an inch. So he placed it in his private archive, in the locked room behind the shop where he kept the truly valuable items. The room smelled of preservatives and old secrets, lined with locked glass cabinets and iron-bound shelves. He set the Chronicle atop the marble pedestal where he'd once displayed banned grimoires and misattributed religious texts, books that collectors would pay handsomely for, legitimate or not. But at night, the Chronicle began to change. The first sign was the sound of metal scraping against stone, so faint he almost convinced himself it was the building settling. Then came the dreams. He dreamed of Amelia standing in the corner of his bedroom, just beyond the reach of the streetlight that leaked through his curtains. She was exactly as he remembered her at 7 years old. Gap-toothed smile, pigtails tied with blue ribbon, wearing the white dress their mother had sewn for church. But her eyes were gone, replaced by dark hollows that seemed to drink in light. In her small hands, she held the Chronicle. The chains hung loose around it like broken promises. She smiled, but the mouth was too wide, filled with too many teeth. "You said you'd remember me," she whispered, and her voice was the sound of pages turning in an empty room. He awoke with a gasp to find his bedroom door standing open, though he always locked it before sleep. Cold air flowed in from the archive, carrying the scent of salt and decay. When he stumbled downstairs to check on the Chronicle, he found it exactly where he'd left it. Except the chains had come undone, lying in neat coils around the pedestal's base. The book lay open to a page that had been blank when he'd first examined it. Then the ink began to move. Not spill or smear, move, as if it possessed its own will, its own purpose. At first, the changes were subtle, faint shapes appearing in the margins overnight, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Then came letters, forming words in handwriting that looked disturbingly like his own. Descriptions of events he was certain he'd never experienced, accounts of conversations he'd never had. The Chronicle began filling itself with his life, but not the life he remembered living. According to its pages, he had a regular customer named Mrs. Holloway, who came in every Tuesday looking for books about Victorian mourning customs. He had no memory of such a woman, yet when Tuesday arrived, she appeared at his door exactly as described. She was elderly, dressed in black wool despite the warmth of the day, and she spoke in the precise, measured tones the Chronicle had attributed to her. "Do you have anything new on mourning portraiture?" she asked, and Greer found himself nodding and leading her to a section of the shop he couldn't remember organising. A letter appeared on his desk that evening, written in his own hand. "You wish to remember her. Now the world will remember you instead. The exchange is fair. A life for a life, a memory for a memory. What was lost will be found. What was found will be lost." He laughed it off as an elaborate prank, perhaps orchestrated by one of his competitors. Collectors of rare tomes were often more peculiar than the books they pursued, after all. Someone was clearly playing games with his mind, using techniques that were clever but not supernatural. Until the fire. The flames should have consumed everything. Greer woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the crackle of burning paper, a sound that struck terror into the heart of any book dealer. He rushed downstairs expecting to find his life's work reduced to ash and ruin. Instead, he found only the back storeroom scorched, the shelves blackened but intact. The books remained untouched, though they reeked of smoke. There had been no fire brigade, no alarm bells in the night. The neighbouring shops showed no signs of damage or concern. But the air in the storeroom now carried a different scent beneath the smoke. Violet and dust, the perfume Amelia had worn to church on Sundays. That was when the shop truly began to change. Clocks throughout the building started running backward, their hands moving counterclockwise with deliberate precision. Customers would enter mid-conversation about books they'd supposedly discussed with him before, though he had no memory of meeting them. When he tried to ask for clarification, they would simply fade away, leaving only the scent of old paper and confused memories. The windows began showing streets that didn't exist, cobblestone lanes that curved impossibly, lined with shops that sold memories and dreams. Sometimes he glimpsed figures walking those phantom streets, their faces obscured by shadow and distance. One morning, he discovered his name carved deep into the wall behind the main counter, the letters filled with what looked like dried ink. The carving was old, weathered as if it had been there for decades, though he would have sworn the wall had been unmarked the day before. Thaddeus Greer, purveyor of forgotten things, keeper of names. The Chronicle no longer needed to be opened by human hands. It opened itself throughout the day, always to a different page, always revealing new entries written in his handwriting, stories of lives he'd never lived, people he'd never met, events that felt more real than his own memories. One afternoon, he found it open to a page titled The Forgotten Sister. The entry described a girl named Amelia Greer, aged 7, who had died of consumption in the winter of 1850. But the details were wrong. She died in summer, of fever, in 1855. Or had she? The more he tried to remember, the more the facts seemed to shift and blur. The final line of the entry read, "To restore what is lost, you must become what forgets." Greer discovered the trapdoor 3 days later, though he suspected it had always been there, waiting for him to notice. It was hidden beneath the marble pedestal, revealed only when he moved the Chronicle to clean beneath it. The iron ring was warm to the touch, as if heated by some internal fire. When he pulled it open, cold air rushed up from below, carrying whispers in languages he didn't recognize. The stone steps descended much farther than the building's foundation should have allowed. He counted 47 steps before reaching the bottom, each one carved with symbols that matched those on the Chronicle's spine. The cellar was impossibly vast, stretching beyond the flickering glow of his oil lamp. Stone shelves lined the walls, filled not with books, but with glass jars containing what looked like smoke and starlight. Each jar bore a name, etched in silver: Thomas Whitmore, beloved father; Sarah Chen, devoted teacher; Marcus Sullivan, faithful friend. At the centre of the space stood an ornate mirror in a frame of tarnished silver, but his reflection wasn't his own. The figure looking back at him was older, draped in robes of deep black. Its face bore traces of his own features, but sharpened and refined, as if carved from pale stone. The eyes were pools of ink, dark and bottomless. Behind the robed figure, another stood in shadow, his face half forgotten, but the initials EN shimmered faintly in the ink around his silhouette. Beyond them, both stretched a room filled with books that whispered secrets to the empty air, their pages turning of their own accord. The Chronicle sat open on a desk, its pages turning ahead of his own thoughts, revealing futures he hadn't yet chosen. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. The figure stared back with those ink-dark eyes, and slowly raised one pale hand to press against the glass from the other side. The mirror's surface rippled like water. Greer stumbled backward up the stone steps, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he reached the shop above, he ran for the front door, only to find smooth wall where the entrance should have been. The windows now opened onto nothing but grey fog and the sound of distant weeping. He was trapped in his own shop, imprisoned by forces he'd spent his life denying. The Chronicle lay open on the counter, though he was certain he'd left it downstairs. A new page had appeared, written in his own careful handwriting. Thaddeus Greer, Curator of the Lost. Born, October 13th, 1843. Died, to be determined. Remembered by the Chronicle of Forgotten Names. Significance: Keeper of Memories, Guardian of the Lost, Sacrifice for the Forgotten. As he watched in horror, more text began to appear. He who seeks to remember the dead must first forget the living. The exchange is absolute. The debt is paid in full. The ink began crawling off the page like liquid shadow, flowing across the counter toward his hands. Where it touched his skin, his memories began to fade. First the recent ones, what he'd eaten for breakfast, the name of the customer who'd visited yesterday. Then older memories, his first day at the shop, the day he left Cambridge, his parents' faces. But Amelia's face grew clearer with each lost memory, as if the Chronicle was trading his life for hers, his existence for her remembrance. Panicked, he grabbed a pen and a scrap of paper. With trembling hands, he wrote a single name and pressed it between the Chronicle's pages. Amelia Greer. The book pulsed once, like a heart finding its rhythm. Every gas lamp in the shop exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging him into absolute darkness. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the building, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Then, nothing. Thaddeus Greer awoke in the cellar, lying on cold stone beside the empty mirror frame. The glass had shattered, leaving only sharp fragments that reflected nothing at all. Where the mirror had stood, a new pedestal had appeared. Upon it sat the Chronicle, open to a fresh page. The jar-lined shelves had vanished, replaced by empty stone walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. He understood now what the Chronicle required, what it had always required. Not just a reader, but a keeper. Someone to tend the memories of the forgotten, to ensure that no name was ever truly lost. He picked up the pen that lay beside the book, his pen, though he couldn't remember placing it there, and wrote his name at the top of the blank page. Not to be remembered by future generations, but so that Amelia could be. So that her name would live on in the Chronicle's pages, while his faded from the world above. The ink accepted his offering, spreading across the page like spilled wine. As it dried, he felt the weight of his new purpose settling around him like a mantle. The Chronicle began to write itself again, filling with new names, new stories of the lost and forgotten. And in the margins, in handwriting that looked like his but felt like hers, appeared the first entry about a girl named Amelia Greer, who had loved books and blue ribbons and the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. She would be remembered. That was all that mattered now. In the shop above, customers would still come and go, though they would find the proprietor somewhat changed, paler, quieter, with eyes that seemed to look through them to something beyond. They would buy their books and leave, carrying stories they didn't know they were helping to preserve. And in the cellar below, the Chronicle would continue its work, ensuring that no name would ever be truly forgotten, no story ever completely lost. The exchange was complete. The debt was paid. And somewhere in the space between memory and forgetting, Amelia Greer smiled with her gap-toothed grin and tied her blue ribbons, eternal and remembered at last. Memory is not a gift. It is a debt, and the Chronicle pays it with ink, with silence, and with sacrifice. Thaddeus Greer will not be remembered by the world above, but beneath, where stories sleep in glass and names whisper in the dark, he has become what all keepers must. The book writes on, the lost are found, and the Chronicle begins again.